This Airbus A330 is just attempting to take off from a runway in Brisbane, Australia. From the outside, everything looks perfectly normal as the airline lifts into the night sky. But in the cockpit, some of the most important instruments have failed, leaving the pilots without vital information for their flight. Will they be able to solve these problems, and will they make it back? Find out with me today as we take a look at the interesting case of Malaysian Flight 134. Welcome to Airspace. On July 18, 2018, a Malaysia Airlines Airbus A330 arrived in Brisbane, Australia. Its flight had been entirely and completely uneventful. As it parked on the stand, passengers and crew left the aircraft, grateful to finally having arrived after their 8-hour-long flight. But for the ground staff, that is the cleaners, loading staff, catering and so on, the work only began at this time, since the aircraft was scheduled to return to Kuala Lumpur just 3 hours later. To ensure the aircraft and its systems were in good order and safe for their return flight, 2 maintenance engineers also arrived at the aircraft and began their checks and tasks. One of these men was a support engineer who was employed locally at Brisbane Airport. The other one was a travelling aircraft engineer for Malaysia Airlines, who was responsible to carry out and manage the technical handling of the aircraft during its ground time. When the A330 arrived on stand, the local support engineer quickly made its way to the nose of the aircraft, where the pitot tubes are located. These tube-like protrusions close to the nose are the plane's airspeed sensors. In essence, they just measure the pressure of the air that's being pushed into them. The faster the plane flies, the more air is forced into these tubes, creating a higher pressure. This pressure value is then converted into an airspeed indication in the cockpit. When he reached the aircraft, the support engineer fitted protective covers over these tubes to protect them from any unwanted obstructions. This is rather unusual and is usually only done when an aircraft is parked for a much longer time. Then why did he do that? You see, the area surrounding Brisbane Airport has a rather unique problem. It is home to a pesky little insect called the mud wasp. It is named for its nests, constructed mostly from mud or sand, which are sometimes built within abandoned nests or other species or, more notably, in small cavities within human-made objects. Essentially, the pitot tubes of aircraft offer these wasps a potentially perfect location to build a nest. It's free real estate, so to speak. The airport of Brisbane identified the problem and issued a notice to airlines, which recommended the use of pitot tube covers during ground stops to avoid any tube blockage by nosy wasps. So, the support engineer did as was prescribed and installed the pitot tube covers. After that, he left to get some supplies. In the meantime, the Malaysian engineer had started his walk-around inspection of the aircraft, during which essential components of the aircraft are checked. Here, the Malaysian engineer noted that the pitot tubes cover had been installed and made a mental note to talk to the support engineer about them. When the latter returned, the 2 men spoke briefly, but since the Malaysian engineer was quite busy, the support engineer just mentioned that he had fitted the pitot tube covers and asked whether his assistance was needed with other tasks. The Malaysian engineer told him that he didn't need any assistance, since there was no task that required the presence of 2 technicians. After that, the support engineer left the Airbus A330 to work on other planes. By that time, the Malaysian engineer had forgotten to ask about the pitot tube covers. Tiny human errors like this cause massive catastrophes. But the airline industry has even bigger issues to solve than a single Malaysian engineer. Recently, safety problems caused a total halt in Boeing's Dreamliner production, and that just happened this week. The airline industry on the whole has lost $220 billion in just 18 months, with real effects on people around the globe. Americans have already lost an average 20% of their 401ks. Yes, 20%. In part, failing airlines have contributed to the huge losses in the stock market, $36 trillion in total, wiped from portfolios. Now, a stunning survey reveals that more than half of Americans making 6 figures are currently living paycheck to paycheck. But major institutions like Goldman Sachs are also pouring hundreds of millions into low correlation assets. They can still go up, even when stocks flatline. That's why I think today's sponsor is incredible, because it gives you access to these same assets without needing millions. I'm talking about Masterworks, the art investing platform. I was amazed at how easy they make it to invest in paintings from legends like Banksy and Picasso. But what I really like is that Masterworks has already delivered real results, paying out over $35 million to users like you to date. That's 11 exits so far, with every single one returning a profit to their users. Masterworks has done so well, they had to make a waiting list, as paintings can sell out in minutes. But I'm giving you guys priority access right now. To skip it, just click the link below. Now, let's get back to the story. About an hour later, the crew arrived at the aircraft and started their pre-flight preparations. For the flight home, the first officer was the pilot flying, while the captain assumed the role of pilot monitoring, assisting the first officer. It was therefore also the captain's task to perform a pre-flight walk-around of the A330 to ensure it was airworthy and in good condition. While the first officer prepared the cockpit, the captain performed this walk-around and returned a few minutes later, informing the first officer that everything was in perfect order. Satisfied, the crew continued their preparations, and soon the aircraft was ready for pushback. It then taxied to runway 01, where it was given takeoff clearance at 12:30 local time. The first officer advanced the thrust levers and the A330 started rolling down the runway. But just 11 seconds into the takeoff roll, just as the plane passed the speed of 50 knots, a speed flag was displayed to both pilots instead of an airspeed indication. The aircraft had realized that it was moving, but no speed was sensed in the pitot tubes, so something must be wrong, therefore it displayed a red speed flag. The captain immediately reacted to this and said, speed. But the crew continued their takeoff roll. 10 seconds later the captain called 100 knots, a standard call that is usually used to compare the two speed indications between the captain's and the first officer's displays. But since the captain had no indication, he probably must have read this value from the navigation display, which displays ground speed derived from GPS and inertial navigation, but no airspeed. Confused, the first officer called, Then abort? Nudging the captain to stop the takeoff immediately. But the captain just responded by, Borders are red, and the first officer called Captain and suggested, Go to ADR3. ADR3 refers to Air Data Computer number 3, which uses an own independent pitot tube. The first officer probably hoped to recover some speed data using this technique. A good idea, but entirely out of place during the takeoff roll. No switches should be actuated and no troubleshooting should be done while a 220-ton aircraft is hurtling down the runway. But time was running out while the A330 neared the speed where it was supposed to take off. A few seconds later, the captain observed that the ground speed measured by GPS had passed the speed at which the plane was supposed to lift off, and he commanded, rotate, so that the first officer would raise the nose and bring the plane into the sky. The first officer did as ordered and raised the nose to about 13 degrees, all while lacking a valid speed indication. This speed indication is vital in the air, since flying too fast might damage the plane, while flying too slow might cause the wings to stall, which would most likely lead to a crash of the aircraft. To be prepared for situations like this, there is a checklist named Unreliable Speed. This checklist comprises some of the items that every pilot has to know by heart, so-called memory items. Immediately, the first officer should have ensured that the autopilot and auto thrust are off, the flight directors must be switched off, full thrust must be applied and the nose raised to 15 degrees. Additionally, a check of the flaps, speed brakes and landing gear position must be carried out. But, seemingly overwhelmed by the situation, the crew initially just retracted the landing gear, selected a thrust value that was slightly lower than full power, and kept the nose at just 9 degrees. They also flew just straight ahead. A few seconds later, Tower called the aircraft and instructed the pilots to contact the departure controller. Since the captain didn't know the frequency by heart, he asked for it, and the controller responded with the appropriate frequency. But, instead of switching to it, the first officer suggested to declare an urgency with the phrase "pan pan". This is one step removed from the famous Mayday call and is used for situations which are bad, but not as dire as a real full-blown emergency. Immediately after his suggestion, the first officer called "Pan pan, pan pan, pan pan, Malaysian 134, we have unreliable airspeed and request maintain runway track and request climb to 6,000 initially." Unfortunately, this was not heard by the tower controller. Some confusion arose, which was later resolved when another aircraft informed the tower controller that there had been an unanswered urgency call. Finally, Malaysian 134 was again instructed to contact departure radar, where it eventually got the assistance it sought. In the meantime, the plane had climbed to 4,000 feet above the ocean. Now, the first officer ordered the execution of the unreliable speed checklist, but he forgot to perform the initial memory items I mentioned before. This checklist tries to identify which air source is correct or false, and provides a table in which one can find pitch and thrust values which pilots can select to obtain a safe flight condition. While the captain performed the checklist, the first officer maintained the climb and brought the aircraft to an altitude of 11,000 feet. At one point, He even asked the captain to stop the checklist so he could focus on flying the aircraft. Finally, he managed to stabilize the aircraft between 10 and 12,000 feet. Together, the pilots identified that all three of their speed sensors appeared to be blocked or faulty, a highly unlikely scenario. Intermittently, some of their speed scales indicated airspeeds instead of the red flags, but they were all unrealistically low. Therefore, the pilots decided to switch off all three air data computers, which unlocks a pretty ingenious backup speed scale developed by Airbus. When using the BUS, or backup speed scale, the normal speed indication is replaced by a colored band that indicates fast, slow or green, which helps the pilots to fly in situations like these. It uses data derived from the angle of attack and GPS sensors. From my own experience scattered in simulator sessions, I can't overstate how much this system helps to reduce the workload of pilots. Instead of constantly reading values from a table, one can just rely on a conveniently color-coded speed band. The pilots of Malaysian 134 experienced the same relief, since flying now became a whole lot easier for them. They could now discuss their options for landing, and eventually, they decided to return to Brisbane for an overweight landing on runway 01. Since the A330 in question had no fuel jettison system installed, it could land above its certified maximum landing weight in certain conditions. During this time, the captain controlled the aircraft. To stabilize the aircraft, the crew requested a nice, long and straight instrument landing system approach to runway 01. They were provided with vectors to just that, a nice 20 nautical mile long final approach. During their preparations for landing, the two pilots also discussed who should be landing the A330 under the given circumstances. While the Malaysian Airlines policy dictated that the captain should do so in abnormal situations, the pair decided that the first officer should do it, since he had almost 10 times more flight hours on this type of aircraft. The captain, having just 550 hours on the A330 under his belt, felt confident that the first officer would do a better job. This is amazing to see and highlights that this crew, once they overcame their initial shock, performed as a great team. As the plane neared the runway, the crew also had to perform a so-called gravity gear extension. Since a safety valve that is related to airspeed blocks the normal hydraulic actuation, the landing gear doors and gear struts have to be lowered by gravity. This works well, but contrary to a normal gear extension, the landing gear doors remain open after the landing gear struts lock in place. At midnight, just about an hour after takeoff, the first officer touched the 211-ton A330 down smoothly at higher than normal speed. He stopped the aircraft 1,600 meters from the runway end, where it remained for a while for inspection by fire services. Unfortunately, the aircraft could not be moved immediately due to the fact that the landing gear doors made contact with the runway. While the pilots waited for their aircraft to be cleared to move, they called the Malaysian engineer to the cockpit. Coincidentally, he was supposed to travel home with the flight. When he reached the cockpit, the pilots explained their instrumentation problem, and at that moment, it dawned on the engineer that most probably the pitot covers had not been removed before flight. A flight deck window was opened and the presence of the now burnt plastic covers was confirmed. After ground inspections were completed and it was established that it was safe to tow the aircraft off the runway, it was brought to a terminal where all passengers and crew disembarked safely. Fortunately, damage to the A330 was very limited. The landing gear doors had minor scrape marks, and the pitot tube heating, normally designed to prevent icing in flight, had burned through the plastic pitot covers in some places. An investigation into this odd occurrence began soon after the flight, and it revealed interesting human factor problems. In fact, no less than 4 walk-around inspections concluded by various parties should have detected the presence of the pitot tube covers. The first one was the engineering maintenance inspection, during which the Malaysian engineer detected the presence of the covers, but forgot to ask the support engineer about them. The second was the flight crew walk-around, during which the captain should have spotted the covers, but failed to do so. CCTV cameras confirmed that he performed his walk-around not very diligently, skipping some of the areas he would have been required to inspect. The third one was a pre-departure inspection by a maintenance engineer, which should have been performed by the Malaysian engineer. But he assumed that it was the responsibility of the support engineer, who in turn thought it was the other way around, since the Malaysian engineer had sent him away. Nobody performed this inspection. And finally, the fourth inspection should have been done by the ground staff working the aircraft. Here again, multiple persons believed that they were not responsible and somebody else had performed the inspection already. To summarize, this is a perfect case study of human error and typical human shortcomings. First, many parties assumed facts instead of clearing things up, Like for example, when the support engineer told the Malaysian engineer that he had fitted pitot tube covers but received no response. Second, there was a pretty significant expectation bias in all parties. None of them really expected to see covers installed on pitot tubes, as this is a rare sight to see. Out of hundreds of inspections done, the captain for example probably never saw covers installed on any of them, so he did not expect to see them this time. And lastly, this case shows that despite proper training, humans sometimes make strange decisions under stress. When the captain could just have cancelled the takeoff at low speed when the problem was first detected, he froze and continued the takeoff. The Australian Transportation Safety Board found numerous risks and contributing factors to this incident eventually. Among them were the fact that there had been no clear guidance on how the two engineers were to work together and who would be responsible for what. Also, the board stated that clearly, many of the involved parties did not work diligently, and if they had, this whole mess could have been avoided. And lastly, it found that Airbus should create a more prominent alert on the flight deck that warns crews of erroneous speed indication. But finally, it also praised the manufacturer for its backup speed scale system, which greatly helped the pilots in their dire situation. The board also commented that once they had overcome their initial shock, the pilots worked together very well and managed to defuse this unpleasant incident. Luckily, this flight ended well, and maybe it can be a lesson for our everyday work. If we continue to perform our duties like we should, especially in aviation, incidents like this one can be avoided in the future. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for many interesting aviation videos. If you'd like to support our work, make sure to check out our Patreon in the pinned comment down below. I offer many cool benefits for as little as $3 a month. Your contribution is highly appreciated and helps me to rely less on YouTube's unreliable algorithm. Thank you so much, and see you in the next video.